Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway. Gayatri's still abroad, researching global warming. It deserves the description of the greatest political upset since Clement Attlee defeated the great war leader Winston Churchill in 1945. Jeremy Corbyn's landslide victory as Labour leader confounded bookmakers, pundits and opponents alike, and probably came as something of a surprise to the man himself too. The crushing of the openly Blairite candidate Liz Kendall, she got just 4.5% of the vote, despite or maybe because of Mr Blair's repeated interventions in the campaign, was the second most significant aspect of the result. Corbyn's victory has unleashed the most ferocious media assault in living memory, and it will have come as a bit of a surprise to the watching public that Jeremy Corbyn did not, after all, appear at Prime Minister's questions this week armed to the teeth like a Sandinista guerrilla. Some things are already clear though. Just as Mrs Thatcher once said, every leader needs a Willie, it's too long ago to explain, self-evidently any Labour leader needs a Damian. Damian McBride was a devastating force of nature in defence of former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. And Jeremy Corbyn could have done with him at his side this week. He is at my side, however, and he joins us now on board the Sputnik.
Good to be here, George.
Thanks, Damian. Why didn't he? I mean, I don't know where you are in the jobs market, but they really could have done with you in the first few days.
I think you made enough controversial appointments this week without adding me to the list.
Well, maybe, but, you know, quality, class will out. It was a stumble of from one piece of bad news to another. The long walk, the icy late night walk along the street, which Jeremy Corbyn has to learn he can no longer do ever again, with a Sky News cameraman following him, and one presentational lapse or mistake after another. How did you see it as a consummate professional yourself? What should he have done to avoid it?
The thing is, once you get in this spiral, once you've had a crisis happen to you, then these things just start to escalate. And then, arguably, the Sky one was the first one. And then the shadow cabinet appointments became incredibly difficult because of the number of people that refused to serve and became very chaotic. That chaos then was played out because we got a transcript, effectively, of what was going on inside the room. So you just lurch from one crisis to another. It reminded me very much of the period, and I was ringside seat for this, where Gordon Brown cancelled the election in October 2007 that he planned to have. And then you had one problem after another. Both sort of the self-inflicted things, but also just the total bad luck. You know, someone loses the child benefit discs and that all gets blamed on Gordon. It's all hapless Gordon. And of course, once you get to that, you're dealing with one crisis when the next is around the corner. So they're dealing with all the crises at the start of this week, and nobody is thinking about that Battle of Britain ceremony and the fact that the national anthem is going to be played. So Jeremy is then standing there, having to make a decision in real time himself, probably because nobody thought it through in advance and told him, you need to decide whether you're singing the anthem or not. And I don't care whether he did or not, but he needed to plan for the media impact of that. So if you're not going to sing the anthem, then you make that clear beforehand. If you are going to sing the anthem, then you sing it. But you don't leave the leader in that position where he's walking along the street having to decide whether to stop and talk or not, where he's standing in the middle of a congregation having to decide whether to sing the anthem or not. That's why you need someone that's anticipating these problems, anticipating the challenges, and saying, right, we need to think this through.
Let's go back to the beginning. Why did someone not notice that Sky journalists were standing outside the room where the shadow cabinet was being formed and listening at the door, hearing every word?
Yeah.
That's a lapse, isn't it? It's a security lapse in the House of Commons, apart from anything else. Who knew that journalists could roam around and eavesdrop on parliamentary business.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting is that Jeremy Corbyn, they said, kept on coming out of the room to go to the toilet. So he knew there were journalists there. But obviously they didn't know they could be overheard, which is just, I mean, that's stupid, frankly. You've got to assume always that if you're having those kind of sensitive discussions, then you are being overheard. And, you know, for goodness sake, do it in his living room. You know, why do it in the House of Commons where you're that exposed to everyone there? But it's all just symptomatic of just not planning this and not seeing it through. And it's remarkable because for 4 or 5 weeks we've all assumed that he would win. He should have assumed that he would win and that he would need a sort of carefully worked out speech to make when he stood up at the conference, rather than what seemed like almost a bit of a free-form ramble. He should have known that he was going to have these problems in appointing his shadow cabinet. And you've got to think those things through in advance. Now, they didn't do that. That's why they ended up lurching from crisis to crisis. And fantastically for him, he got up and delivered a masterclass at Prime Minister's Question, which steadied the ship.
He really steadied the ship.
And he needed that, because imagine if that had gone the other way. Imagine if that had gone badly. And I think Conservative MPs are probably kicking themselves that they didn't try and destabilise him by greeting him in the wall of noise, you know, by trying to sort of maintain the decorum of the place. So if that had gone badly, I think by the end of this week, you know, it will be regarded as the worst first week in any party leader's history.
Yeah, and who knows what could have happened once a banana skin's underneath you. You can keep on sliding. But he did stabilise the ship, and I think the two things that we've been discussing show the strengths and weaknesses very much of the man. He's not spun. He's never spun. He didn't know you could be heard through that door because he's never been in that office before. No leader of the opposition, Labour leader, has ever invited him in. He is a good and honest man. That's why he didn't feel that he could sing out the national anthem, because he's not a believer in either God or the Queen. But there are things you just have to do when you're in his position. But because he's a principled person, he didn't do it. He's now going to. But the brilliant wicket that he played at Prime Minister's Questions is because after 33 years in the House of Commons, actually, even though you've never been a minister, never been a shadow minister, 33 years as a parliamentarian gives you quite a good feel for what might unsettle or wrong foot the other side. And I thought that he did it brilliantly.
Yeah, he did. And I think the great thing about what he did there was he's established the technique. You had people, I mean, I lost count of the number of people afterwards who were saying, but it was boring and he didn't really hold into account. They were missing the point.
Yes.
What he needed to do was establish that technique. And sort of, you could see how unsettled Cameron was by it. And then this becomes a technique he can play with any way he wants. And it will be perfect for him in a week where there is public outrage about something the government has done. And usually, when Ed Miliband would have what people called the open goals, so Ed Miliband would come along to Pmqs and everyone would say, oh, he's got an open goal today against Cameron. And Cameron was brilliant in those situations, because whatever Miliband said, he'd just ignore it and just rant about the mess that Labour had made, or the mess of Ed Miliband's leadership. And so it just ended up being a score draw, and people would say, oh, Miliband fluffed his moment. Now, that can't happen with Jeremy Corbyn. And the reason why is when he stands up and in calm, measured tones says, Steve from Romford has asked me to express his outrage to you at the decision that you've taken on such and such, then David Cameron can't back and sort of just rant about Labour, because he's got to answer Steve from Romford's question. And this is the brilliance of that technique.
And as you pointed out, alone in the British media, he can vary at any time he likes. In fact, he can make a decision as he stands up. That actually this week I'm not going to ask Steve from Romford. I'm going to ask you this. And it's about time you answered. Cameron will not be expecting that, won't know when, if ever, that moment is going to arrive. So he's given himself, as it were, another club that he can choose and wrong foot the opposition still further.
And there's also, as well as sort of, spontaneously deciding to do it, I would say once every 6 months, if you're the opposition leader, something comes into your hands. You get a leaked document, or you get some dynamite piece of information from a Freedom of Information request or a parliamentary question you've laid down. And that's when he can really wrong foot Cameron, because Cameron will attend, expecting it to be whatever topical, popular issue the public have been raising that week, and instead, Jeremy Corbyn could say, I have in my hand a piece of paper, and totally wrong foot Cameron. And this will be, it'll be fascinating to watch how Corbyn uses that technique. And as you say, with all the parliamentary experience to go with it.
Now, another piece that you wrote, again uniquely, with which I strongly agree, was the comparison between Corbyn and Attlee. Which I just made in my introduction as the last most surprising thing that ever happened in British politics. Tell us what comparisons you see.
Well, I mean, the first and most obvious was that, you've represented an inner London constituency. Jeremy Corbyn is the first Labour leader, indeed the first leader of any major party to represent an inner London constituency since Attlee. And I think
in my old constituency,
of course.
Green. Yeah.
And of course it gives you an entirely different perspective. And it's astonishing to compare David Cameron's constituency with Jeremy Corbyn's and think about the different view of the country that gives them. In David Cameron's constituency, 1 in 250 people is black. In Jeremy Corbyn's constituency, it's 1 in 7. The levels of home ownership are staggeringly different, and the levels of deprivation staggeringly different. And this is where Jeremy Corbyn's politics comes from. I mean, he was always, academically, he was always a socialist. That was how he was brought up. But you don't represent an area like that for 30 years, an area which is actually faces the issue of immigration on a daily basis, has seen its own face change as sort of different nationalities have come into the area over the years. It's faces serious problems with crime, massive problems with poverty, massive problems with mental health. You don't see all that for 30 years and it not influence and shape the principles that you have and go into politics with. That's, what you're in politics for. And this is his great asset, is that authenticity that he's got comes from those deep-rooted principles. And the sense of who he represents. So that's the most important thing. But I also think, Attlee gave a masterclass in, you don't have to cout out of the media. You can be pretty disdainful of the media and still be a highly successful politician. But just by being a sort of straight-talking guy that, goes out and sells your message but doesn't sell yourself. And I think that's what's attractive about him.
Last word then, and in just a few words. Am I right in my surmise that the 4.5% for Liz Kendall represents the final defeat for Tony Blair?
Yes, I mean, it was devastating for her, and especially because she started as the media darling and then just couldn't cut it in her own party. And it almost shows you that there's that break, that what were traditionally the sort of Blairite candidates that would work for the media are never going to cut it with the Labour Party anymore. And that's partly Tony Blair's legacy, that he's lost the Labour Party to that wing of the party.
Is he going to leave? Are they going to leave? Is there going to be a new party?
They will always think that by staying in, they will eventually get their party back. Tony Blair himself will go round and identify, as they always have done, who's the next Blairite candidate, who's the next one that's going to ride over the hill to the rescue. And there's no shortage of candidates for that, but I don't think they'll ever win again.
I'll tell you what, this man's so good and this subject's so important, I'm going to ask him to stay for the second half. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sputnik. We're reviewing from our orbit of experience the initial few days of the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn and where it might go next. And I'm speaking with Damian McBride, who once upon a time looked after, quite ferociously actually, Gordon Brown, and very grateful for it was Mr. Brown, as well he might be. Damian, thanks for staying on for the second half. Let's look at the shadow cabinet that Mr. Corbyn has constructed. Some might say, I would say, that he gave away a little too much, and in so far as he did, he actually gave himself an additional problem of perceived gender imbalance. How did you see the shadow cabinet that emerged?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was almost as though, and you get politicians that do this sometimes, there's an appointment they really want to make, and then they feel they've got to make compensating appointments to sort of reassure another wing of the party. So the appointment he really wanted to make was John McDonnell becoming Shadow Chancellor, which I think was essential in terms of him being able to sort of bind the two of them together and sort of secure his, if you like, secure the revolution that they've just achieved. But then I think he felt he needed to make compensating appointments. So you get sort of Andy Burnham coming into a top position, Hilary Benn into a top position, and they're sort of very safe appointments, but there's nothing radical about them. And you know, as you say, he's giving a bit away there, because these are not people that are ideological soulmates. They're not people that are really going to go along with his agenda.
On the contrary, Hilary Benn, the son of Tony Benn, the late and great Tony Benn, was out confronting Jeremy Corbyn within 24 hours on the issue of the European Union and the Cameron negotiations, and on the Trident issue. It's going to be a very, very important lodestar for Jeremy Corbyn. Hilary Benn's just not on side with him. So you could make the case for one of those two getting the job, but giving both of them a job seemed to me perhaps a bit of a hostage to fortune. But let's look ahead. Jeremy stabilised the ship, did really well at Pmqs, perhaps has come up with a good formula for Pmqs. From Wednesday to Wednesday, I expect he'll not be around the House of Commons much. He'll be around the country, building on this revolution, aiming for that magic 1 million members mark, which is definitely within his grasp now. Is that what you would advise if you were at his side?
Yeah, but he's got to do both. I think they've got to make a slight adjustment from going from campaign mode to leadership mode. Now, during a campaign, which is effectively only reaching a sort of, very small bit of the population, the rest of the population largely ignored it, and most of the media did as well, it energised and mobilised that small group of people and got hundreds of thousands more to join the party, and did that very successfully. And you can do that through rallies in different towns. You can do it through social media and energise that group of people. But if you want to reach the public as a whole, you've got to do more than that. It can't just be about rallies and can't just be about social media. So he does have to engage with the mainstream media in some ways, or have trusted ministers that are on side, not the ones that are going to contradict his policy positions, that are going to go out and be his cheerleaders on the national news media. I mean, I've found myself acting as a bit of a cheerleader for him over recent days and this difficult week that he's had, just because nobody else is doing it. And, that's an extraordinary position for a leader to find himself in. So he needs trusted colleagues that are going to do that. But at some point, he needs to go out and start doing that himself. Set-piece, big interviews with major broadcasters and the major newspapers, going out there and trying to sell himself to the wider public.
Problem is, the media, the mainstream media, is treating him like he's a hunted animal rather than the landslide victor. And the leader of Her Majesty's opposition, a position worthy of respect by any standards. I suppose you'll be apprehensive about big sit-down interviews with top people. Who should he go to first? Who would he go to first?
Well, he should have done that interview with Andrew Marr on the first Sunday he became leader. He did the worst of all worlds, which is saying that he'd do it, then pulling out. And, that happened across the board with quite a few of his interviews over this first week. So, you've got to do those big set-piece things. He'll have to do them at the Labour Party conference. But also, you can, what I would definitely advise him to do is to get out there into the regional media as well. They would bite his hand off. The regional media, the most trusted media there is. Get on the local radio, go into those local newspapers and give them interviews whenever he goes to visit these towns. And that's the way to sort of, reach that wider public as well.
There's quite a stark contrast between the good and honest man, homespun, wearing a vest, tweed jacket, a guy who's obviously not spent, an hour in front of the mirror getting makeup sprayed on him, and the flashman, David Cameron, pumped up, born to rule, Bullingdon boy. But of course, it will not be David Cameron that Jeremy fights in the general election, if God spares us all, in 2020. It'll most likely, won't it, be George Osborne. What will that contest look like?
Well, I mean, it's an even more stark contrast than Corbyn versus Cameron, because in some ways, at least Cameron has the popular touch. We can't deny that, much as, we might hate it. But Osborne has no popular touch, much as he's tried to work on it. And Osborne is a man that is totally unrecognisable in terms of the way he spoke, the way he looked, and that kind of thing, from the politician that came in five years ago. He is spun. He's spun to the nth degree. And that's got to be the contrast that Jeremy portrays. It would be a bit more difficult for Jeremy if he was up against Boris Johnson, who, again, is one of those characters that is able to present himself to the public as a bit authentic and unspun and, equally happy to look a bit dishevelled at times. So I think Corbyn should want that contest against George Osborne, not least because if Jeremy Corbyn's going to succeed over the next 5 years, he needs it to be because of the economy. Now, no one would wish there to be an economic crisis, but if there is, Jeremy Corbyn's prescription for that crisis, that we've got to reshape society and do our economy fundamentally differently, that will suddenly have a resonance that it might not at the moment with the wider public. And Osborne would be exactly the man he'd want in the frame to be opposing.
I'm really glad that it looks like it's going to be Osborne. I think he's the best possible opponent for Jeremy Corbyn to fight. But let's talk about Scotland, which is potentially a place, only potentially, where a Jeremy Corbyn Labour Party could make significant gains in parliamentary seats and in share of the vote, not least because things are so bad. But once Scotland was a great Labour stronghold, and now, of course, it isn't. But a real Labour leader, capital R, real Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, on the Trident issue, on issues of austerity and all the other policy planks that he has, must stand a real chance, of outflanking the SNP and winning people come back home to Labour, don't you think?
Yeah, exactly. And I've heard people on radio shows this week who've been saying exactly that. You'll have some people that will never forgive Labour, just as the brand, for siding with the Tories in the referendum debate, and those people have almost sort of gone full scale over to the nationalist side. But there is a sort of another huge swathe of people, a good chunk of that SNP vote, that deserted Labour because they said that party doesn't represent me anymore, as they showed during the referendum debate. And Jeremy Corbyn can wipe that away. He would never have made the mistake of sharing a platform with the Tories, and he would have made the working class case, the workers' case for why we need to stay in the union, and that is what Jeremy Corbyn can do. So I think he's got a massive opportunity to reclaim that ground in Scotland, and you can see, he's the one Labour politician that's gone to Scotland over recent times and been able to stand in town halls without having things thrown at him. And instead he gets enthusiastic crowds. And he's got to, I think one of the first good announcements that he made was that he's going to spend one day a month in Scotland, over the course of his leadership.
His crowds were nearly as big as mine. The irony of that should not be lost. The man being traduced for refusing to sing the national anthem may be the one man who can save the union of Scotland and England. Keep the country together, stop it being severed across the middle. And how? By being Labour, by being the real, genuine article, the real deal. I think this one day a week that he's going to spend there, the one day Tom Watson's going to spend there, these could be amongst the most valuable days.
So here's the other challenge, George. He can win back those voters that deserted Labour. The big challenge he's got is, can he win back the voters that deserted Labour to go to UKIP?
That's what I was going to turn to. Let me turn to that. The white, working class English people who feel that Labour in the Blair era deserted them and have now gone to UKIP. Can someone like Jeremy win them back?
It depends, because if they believe that the cause of all their ills is immigration and Europe, as many of those people do, and felt that Labour didn't understand that, and that's why UKIP proved attractive for them, Jeremy's not going to be able to persuade those people back. What he can do is change the nature of the discourse. He can persuade those people it's not immigration, it's not Europe. People that come here from foreign countries are in the same boat as you. The real problem is the corporations and the Conservative Party that are always going to keep you where you are, that are never going to let you achieve your ambitions. And he has to almost do what the Labour movement had to do decades and decades ago, which is bring together the white working class with the interests of Irish immigrants, Black Caribbean immigrants, and say, look, you're all in the same boat, and we are the party that represents you. And that's the big challenge. But it'll be fascinating to see him do that, because no Labour politician has had the guts to do that. No Labour politician has gone out to those people and said, yes, we are the party of working people, because they've been so desperately keen to get into the centre ground, because what they've been trying to do, the sort of craven nature that Blair had about this, is say, well, what really matters to us is winning over Conservative voters. And that's not the challenge for Labour now. It needs to win back its own voters.
It needs to win back its own voters who've stopped voting, its own voters who are voting UKIP, its own voters who are voting Nationalist, its own voters who are voting Green. There's more than enough voters there to win an election.
Yeah, and a whole generation of young voters that are just totally alienated and turned off politics entirely and would never bother tuning in. And that's, you know, all those groups of people that we've talked about have been energised by what Jeremy Corbyn has done so far in the party. And he just needs to take that to the rest of the country.
Jez, we can. Now, I know that Jeremy watches the show, so if you're watching, Jeremy, hire this man. It's been quite a week. We could have gone on speaking for another half hour, but we've run out of time and it's the end of the show. I hope you'll join me again next week. Until then, it's been marvellous.